Hello and welcome to today's video. Today we're going to have a look at a playful way to paint florals. So if you like the combination of realism and loose and painterly style, this video is for you. The Dahlia painting challenge is still going on this week, so please don't forget to share your creations in the group for a chance to win a place on the Joy of Watercolor online course. Painting dahlias can certainly be a challenge. Some of them look incredibly complex, but one of my favorite things about these flowers is just how versatile the blooms can be. They come in lots of different colors, lots of different shapes, so I'm feeling spoiled for choice here. To make things a little easier, I'm going to paint this simple cartwheel dahlia today. The thing I love the most about this flower is how fantastically imperfect it is. The flower is asymmetric, the petals are all over the place, none of them are the same size, none of them are the same shape, and that's exactly what makes the image really exciting. So often we chase after perfection. We think that in order for something to look beautiful, we need to paint it perfectly or chase after this perfect reference, but in fact it's usually the quirky little things that make us happy. Weird and wonderful is exactly what I'm going for, and in fact the more imperfectly you paint your flower, the more lively it's going to look in the end. So make yourself a nice drink, relax, and let's paint a dahlia together. I think it's going to be quite important for our creative process that we start without an outline today. The more we try to squeeze the petals into predetermined shapes, the less spontaneous our painting is going to look. I won't be sketching the petals, but I will draw the center of my flower. It's going to become an anchor point and help me plan the painting as I go. It's also going to help me decide on the size of my dahlia. You could freehand the circle or use something like a large coin to trace around it. Here I'm using just a roll of washi tape, but the important thing is that you keep your circle nice and big. We're about to attach lots of small petals around it, so it's going to make life a lot easier if you paint large. For my materials today, I'm using a number 6 soft round brush, Dahlia watercolors, and cold pressed 100% cotton watercolor paper. You don't have to use cotton paper for this particular project, but it will help if you want to add any more layers of paint later. The two main colors I can see in the reference are a very soft, gentle yellow and a bright and cool pink. So the two main colors I've decided to use are lemon yellow and opera rose. Even though opera rose is not a light fast pigment, the thing I really like about the Dahlia version is that even though it's a very bright and vibrant pink, it still looks really natural when used in a painting. It doesn't have that fake fluorescent look that opera pink sometimes has, and I think it will suit the painting really well. Throughout the process, you'll see me transferring colors from my watercolor pans onto my mixing palette. It helps me see how much pigment I'm picking up with my brush. All of my dahlia colors look fairly light, and I really want to avoid adding too much color too soon. The third color I'm going to prepare for now is a vibrant spring green, and I'm going to mix my own using lemon yellow and blue. Most blues will work, but I'm using a touch of phthalo blue for mine. And I'm just going to keep adding the two colors together until I've got a nice amount of green. I'm painting a swatch of each color to check that my color mixes behave as expected before I transfer them to the real painting. I'm going to start with the smallest petals first. They wrap really nicely around the center of my flower and are going to help me plan my composition. The technique I want to use for today is called wet on wet. It means that we will be applying wet paint onto wet paper. Transitions of colors on our flower are very smooth. Using wet and wet will help us to paint smooth gradients and achieve a natural look. I'm starting to paint my petal with a layer of clean water first, and as soon as the shape looks right and I see a nice glossy surface, I'm going to start dropping in a little bit of color. I'm going to start with my lightest colors first. I pick up a tiny amount of yellow on the very tip of my brush and gently brush it on, followed by pink, and again I'm trying to pick up as little of it as possible. When the lightest colors are down, I'm going to come back and add more saturated colors where needed. My petals are very light in color and I don't want to add too much too soon. I really don't want to lose that soft luminous glow of watercolor. Building the colors up slowly will help us not only to keep the paint transparent, but also will help us create a very natural look. Now this is where the circle we drew is going to come in really handy. I'm going to anchor myself by thinking of the circle as a sort of a clock. If the first petal I painted was roughly around 12 o'clock, my second one is going to be somewhere around 1. And again, I'm going to start by painting this petal with a layer of clean water. And again, once I see a shiny wet surface, I'm going to start adding my lightest colors. I'm starting with lemon yellow, and everywhere I see a hint of yellow on the petal, I'm going to gently brush some on. And of course, coming back with the pink, starting with a pale color first, gradually building it up as I go. As I'm applying the colors, I'm taking care to apply them very softly. I'm letting the yellow and the pink sit next to each other, but I avoid blending them together with my brush. If the two colors mix, the petal will turn orange. That's not really the look we're going for, so I'm placing the colors next to each other and letting wet paper do the rest. Because the paper is wet, our two colors are going to gently spread and create a smooth gradient without mixing together. Now if your paper is drying out too fast and you find that you run out of time before you get a chance to build up the colors, I want you to repeat this exercise a few more times until it feels comfortable. If by the time you finish your paper is still wet, you're ready for the next step. I'm going to paint the next petal exactly the same way, starting with the clean water and adding the colors together. Except this time, before my paint dries completely, I'm going to drop in a tiny bit of green at the base of the petal. If you're managing to add all three colors before the paint dries, practice by painting a few more petals like this. If you're struggling to finish on time, just add a little bit more water and go back to step 1. Now the first petal I painted was roughly around 12 o'clock, the next clump is going to be around 3. I'm going to follow the same process as before, starting with an outline of clean water and slowly adding the colors together, starting with a pale lemon yellow, followed by opera rose, and at the very end a tiny little bit of green. If this feels comfortable, let's try something new. And for this one, I really want you to keep an eye on your wet paper. When paper is very wet, the colors will travel and spread until they fill the entire petal shape. This technique is great for laying down large washes of color and making soft color transitions, but it doesn't allow for much detail. However, the more the paper dries, the more our paint tends to sit in place. After I paint the petal, I wait until the surface of my paper turns from very wet to damp and start to sculpt the fine details with the very tip of my brush. Because the paper is still damp, I'm still getting a soft edge, but the final color tends to sit in place, giving me a lot of control over fine details. You can add creases and veins and introduce a pink petal edge. Use this technique to practice water control and add fine detail to the next few petals. For more control, always use the tip of your brush for sculpting petal shapes with water and adding final details. The very last thing I want to add to the painting process is lifting. Lifting simply means wiping away some of the watercolor paint to reveal the white of the paper underneath. It works best when the paper is slightly damp and will help us create really soft natural highlights. To lift, rinse out your brush with clean water and take off all extra moisture with a piece of tissue. Firmly applying pressure, wipe away some of the paint. Repeat this for all highlights you see on the petal and clean your brush between each swipe. Here you see me refining the highlights, wiping my brush clean in between. Make sure you do this step while the paper is still damp. Before painting the next petal, I just want to think about composition. I want to think if I want to include every single petal or change things a little bit. I find the petal that's bending over a little bit distracting. I don't feel it's adding anything to the composition, and if anything makes the image a little bit confusing. I'm choosing not to paint it on my flower. At the same time, I've got quite a large gap between the petals on the left, and I think it will look quite nice if I fill it up a little bit. So I'm going to change and move some of the petals around to make the image more interesting. Some of the small petals are overlapping, with one sitting in front of the other. I'm painting the ones sitting on the top first, and after this layer of paint dries, I'm going to skip ahead and finish the petals that are sitting behind. While the petals are drying, I'm going to paint the center of the flower. And for this, I'm going to add two new colors: Quinacridone Red and Sennelier Yellow Light. Sennelier's version of Quin Red is a warm pink, and I think it will contrast very nicely with the opera rose that we've used before. I'm going to use both colors to paint the center of the flower. I see a lot of orange on the reference photo, so I'm switching to a warmer yellow to keep the color more vibrant. Just as before, I'm going to start with a layer of clean water. I don't want the colors to bleed, so I'm taking care not to touch the bottoms of fresh petals. I'm picking up a generous amount of warm yellow and dabbing it onto the wet surface with the tip of my brush. I want to create an illusion of texture without going into too much detail. I'm creating lots of small fuzzy marks without completely covering the white. I'm going to continue to add more yellow until it looks saturated enough. I want to mix my colors straight on paper for more contrast, so I'm putting a tiny amount of pink on the very tip of my brush and continue to create those textural marks. I'm putting a tiny amount of opera rose on one side of the flower and a touch of Quin Red on the other. Red is a very strong pigment and it can quickly overpower a mix. Adding the color gradually will help me create a sense of depth. I'm letting the tip of my brush dance around the circle shape. From time to time, I will pull the paint over the edge to create a fuzzy outline. Once the orange looks saturated enough, I'm going to drop some pure pigment around the outside. For added interest, I'm adding some pure opera rose to one side and a bit of Quin Red to the other. The center is quite textured on the reference, but I don't want to paint it in great detail. My paper is still wet, so I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of salt for added texture. I'm going to take a break and let the painting dry before I continue to the next step. Once the paint is completely dry, I'm rubbing off the excess salt to reveal the beautiful texture underneath. I'm moving on to my favorite part of this painting. What made the image interesting in the first place are those large, colorful petals. I'm going to start sculpting my first one with a layer of clean water. I'm creating a fine outline with the very tip and then filling the rest with the body of the brush. Once I see a wet, glossy surface, I'm going to start applying the colours, starting with my lightest ones. In order for the wet on wet technique to work, it's really important to start with the right amount of water. A good surface to start with will look very shiny and wet. Think of a very glossy photograph or maybe even a piece of glass. If your paper is wet but the surface doesn't look glossy, it means you need to add more water. If water starts to pool around the outside, creating a puddle, it means you've got too much and you need to wipe away the excess. Starting with the right amount of water will help us control the flow of paint and will let us paint for a bit longer. Remember that our main medium is not paint but water, and it's the amount of water on your paper that's going to decide how the paint is going to spread. When paper is very wet, the colors travel quickly, covering a large area. This stage is best for creating large, smooth gradients. As the water starts to evaporate off the surface, the colors gradually start spreading less and less, giving us more control. This is why I always start with painting big blocks of colors first, saving fine details till the very end. For now my paper is nice and wet, so I'm going to continue to gradually build up the color using lemon yellow and opera rose. The red in the middle of the petal looks a little warmer and I'm starting to see hints of orange. I'm now switching to my warmer quinacridone red, adding a little at a time. My paper is still glossy and wet, so the color creates a lovely soft gradient. The great thing about painting a larger petal is that now we're working with a much larger surface area. It's going to dry out a lot slower, giving us plenty of time to paint. As long as the paper stays wet, we can paint as much as we like. But as soon as you see that the surface is starting to dry out, it's best to leave the painting alone and let it dry completely. Erasing watercolor is hard, by adding more color is very easy. If you don't finish the petal on the first try, you can always come back with another layer. Just remember to let the petals dry completely before you add any fresh paint. My paint is still nice and wet, so I'm going to continue to build up the color, switching between quinacridone red and my warm yellow. I'm going to slow down the video for the first petal so you can see what the process looks like in real time. My paper is starting to change from glossy and wet to kind of visibly damp, so I'm going to concentrate on finishing my smallest details. As soon as I see the paper start to dry out, I'm going to let go and let my petal dry. But before, I still have time to create a few soft highlights. The last thing I want to add to my flower today is a darker, cooler shade of pink for the darkest shadows. For this, I'm going to be using Sennelier's Rose Madder Lake. I'm going to speed up the rest of the video, but the steps I'm going to take are exactly the same. I'm starting with a layer of clean water, making sure to build up a wet, glossy surface. Once I build up enough water, I'm starting to add the colors, starting with lemon yellow and opera rose. I'm starting with the lightest colors first to preserve transparency of watercolor paint. I'm building up the colors slowly, letting them spread for a soft and natural look. Remember, it's easier to add more than to take color away. so I really don't want to rush with this step. I'm using lemon yellow and quin red to warm up the middle of the petal. This time I'm adding some rose madder lake for my darkest darks. I'm trying to keep things simple, so I'm not really trying to paint a shadow. But this is a darker and cooler colour than the ones I've used before, and it will help provide extra visual contrast and bring the little petals forward. Once my paper starts to lose the shiny gloss, I'm going to concentrate on fine details and sculpt them with the tip of my brush. And of course, lift out any highlights before the paint starts to really dry. I'm going to skip ahead and paint the rest of the petals using the same colours. And just to show you that it really is easy to add more colour later, I come back to the first petal and wet it again. I add some rose madder lake to create contrast, and I even have enough time to lift out a few highlights. Now my Dahlia painting is complete. You can leave it as it is or go back and add a couple more layers to build some extra depth. I'm really pleased with how this painting turned out. It was definitely inspired by the reference, but still left plenty of room for us to play around and create something unique. Please don't forget to share your creations in the group and check the link below to find out more about the Joy of Watercolor online course. You can find today's reference photo in the description below. I really hope you enjoyed today's video, and I'm really looking forward to painting together next time. Happy painting and see you soon!